Mahatma Gandhi states, no human being is so bad as to be beyond redemption. At 19 years old, I was sentenced to life in prison with a possibility of parole after serving 20 years. I remember walking into one of the worst prisons in South Carolina at this time. No understanding, no sense of awareness, no understanding of how to serve time. I was just like, because I committed this violent crime, which was murder, I was told to now go serve time and survive the best way you know how. No one ever really taught me about how my crime was going to impact me at some point of my incarceration. And what I mean by impacting me is how the guilt, the hurt, the pain, the remorse was going to wash over me. No one told me how to process this. And as I reflect back to when I was growing up before I was incarcerated, I never was taught how to process these emotions. So when these emotions surfaced or washed over me when I was younger before my incarceration, I ain't found other ways to numb the pain through smoking marijuana, drinking, and just outbursts with my anger. But in prison, it was a different thing. Every day I was surrounded by men who were more violent than me, men who had more time than me, men who were more seasoned than me. But no one never told me how to do time and utilize my time of incarceration to be productive, to be a changed person. I never knew this. From the caseworkers, from the wardens, from the officers, even from the men who were some of the men who were inside of the system with me every day, no one never prepared me for what's going to happen after a certain period of time of incarceration. And no one ever told me about what was the different levels of prison. So here it is, like I said, I knew that I committed a violent crime and I was sent to prison. And many of us, we believe that when men and women are sent to prison, they're sent to a place for punishment and they hope that there's some form of rehabilitation. But unfortunately for violent offenders at the time that I was incarcerated, there was no real rehabilitation program set for me. So it was all based upon you sink or you swim. And most people I knew in that environment, they sunk because no one never prepared them for the wall of emotions that they want to hit while they're incarcerated. So to fast forward in this journey, I remember discovering through trial and error, I discovered something about prison that would save my life, that saved my life in prison. There's several things that I learned. I learned that prison had two levels to it. The first level of in prison was called the recriminalization, and the second level was called decriminalization. No one ever told me this. And what does this mean, recriminalization and decriminalization? Recriminalization was where I noticed that there were individuals who were in this environment who came in one way for one crime, but they had now learned how to commit multiple crimes. And then there was another prison level, which was called the decriminalization. This is where self-discovery takes place, personal development takes place. This is where one learns through their own personal struggle, trial and error, they learn how to become better people. And that was the stage that no one told me about, but through my intent and being intentional about becoming a better person over a course of years, I discovered those two levels of incarceration. And I think it's important that when we send people to prison that we tell them about these things so that they can be able to navigate inside of the prison system to be more productive. There's unfortunately many people sit inside of a prison system idle, unaware of how to become better people because they're not taught the two levels of incarceration, recriminalization, decriminalization, what this looks like. And another thing that I discovered that saved my life, that I believe the reason why I am free today is because of these things that I learned. And these are called the 5 stages of incarceration. During the course of my time of incarceration, my first few years in prison, I was not even concerned about rehabilitation. It was all about how I was going to survive prison. But there came a point in my incarceration where, as I said, I hit this wall. And this wall was called the wall of reality, the wall of emotions, the wall of hurt, the wall of grief, the wall of pain that I hit as a result. These things came as a result of that crime that I committed. No one never told me that the spirit of my victim was going to be something that I had to face one day in a prison cell. So what happened, it was one Friday night. I remember I was sitting in my cell and I was watching a show called Dateline. Some of you are familiar with that show. I believe it still comes on. But on this particular night, I remember turning the channel and I saw this mother, I heard this mother grieving and crying uncontrollably over the loss of her loved one. That to this day, the voices, her cry still pierces my ears. I still hear it. That's how painful it was. But then in that moment, I realized, I asked myself a question like, Lester, do you think your victims, the crime that you committed, do you think your victims feel this way? And for the first time in my incarceration, I thought about that. As I said, no one ever told me this. This was something that I believe that it just came to me. And I remember I finished watching that hour of Dateline and I remember turning the TV off and I remember just sitting in that bed and thinking about, wow, I never thought about my victims for the first 5 years. And it was not because I was insensitive or anything like that, but it was because I was in a violent environment. And when I'm entering into a violent environment, you don't have time to think about anything that you have done in the past. It's always about the here and now, how I'm going to survive. But this night, everything else was blocked out. And I sat inside that cell after watching Dateline and hearing that mother's uncontrollable cry and screaming and her pain in her voice helped me to realize that it was time for me to address my own pain. My pain and the pain that I caused someone else. So I laid in that bed, not expecting anything, but I just laid there. And I remember late that night, I woke up and it was a heavy spirit over me. It was something heavy weighing me down. And I got up that night, uncontrollable. My emotions was just overwhelming. I was sobbing from the pain and the grief and the hurt. And in this moment, I realized that, I could not fight this any longer. I had to surrender to it. And I surrendered. And in my surrender, I remember laying on my floor inside my prison cell. And I remember begging for the first time, begging my victim to forgive me. For the first time, I remember inside my prison cell, I now began to call my victim by his name. In this cell, in that moment, I remember making a promise to my victim that I will live my life differently as a matter to honor and respect him. But the thing that I found after this night is, as I said, the thing that saved my life. And I believe it saved not only my life, but the lives of many other men who I was incarcerated with, is when I started taking the time to journal and write and be in deep introspection. I discovered 5 stages of incarceration and the 2 levels of incarceration of the prison environment. But the 5 stages of incarceration was what changed my life. And this first stage of incarceration was this self-denial. I realized that myself and the hundreds of other men that I came in contact with in prison, their entry into the prison is not about reflection, is not about ownership. It's about creating a wall or walls to prevent you or protect you from the pain that you have caused yourself and that you have caused to others. That was denial. Not only that, but I found out that that stage of self-denial was where many men were in denial about the abuse that they suffered and how that abuse led to the second level or the second stage of incarceration, which was anger. If you were sexually abused, physically abused, abandoned, all of that, your anger is rooted in that. Because anger was the thing that you see flowing throughout the prison every day. Everybody in prison is angry. And I always wonder, where did my anger come from? Where did this person's anger come from? And it was rooted in the first stage of incarceration, self-denial. The second stage of incarceration was anger. And I needed to help him. I needed to find out what were those things that was leading to my anger. Which led me to the third stage, was victimization. That is so common that many individuals who are incarcerated never learn to take ownership for their crime. It's part of the criminal thinking process. But for me, I remember my first few years, I never wanted to take ownership for my crime. I would always blame everyone and everything the reason why I was in prison. I even went to the point where I knew I didn't want to pronounce my victim's name. But over that time, I go back again to, as I mentioned, that Friday night, watching Dateline. This is when I realized that I needed to take ownership for my crime. I needed to start honoring my victim by calling him by his name, which is Gary. Which leads me to my fourth stage of incarceration, which I discovered through my self-reflection. I realized that there was power in forgiveness. And I realized it was so difficult for me to forgive myself because of the crime that I committed. But I realized that in part of my growth as a person while I was in prison, in order to put me on this stage tonight, was I needed to have a breakthrough, and I needed to come to a point of forgiveness. I needed to seek atonement from God, needed to seek forgiveness from those who I've harmed. And I needed to seek forgiveness in myself. And by me doing that work and seeking forgiveness, writing a letter to my victims, now honoring my victims by mentioning his name, living my life different as a form of respecting and honoring my victims, it brought forth a change of heart. That change of heart, which is the transformation, which is the last stage of my incarceration, of the 5 stages of incarceration, this is where change shifted, the paradigm shifted. This is why I started seeing life differently. And from that, I remember creating these curriculums in this 5 stages of incarceration. I created these curriculums and started teaching the men in prison and start helping them awaken and helping them identify these different stages of incarceration, understand the different levels of prison. And I started seeing this dramatic change taking place not only in me, but also taking place in the many men that I came in contact with. And it was all based upon what I discovered, the 5 stages of incarceration. And I always look back to this day, and I always said, I wish there was someone would have gave me, other than the rule books of the do's and do nots of prison, I wish that someone would have gave me a rule book my first day in prison and how to serve time and how to find redemption serving time. Unfortunately, no one never gave me that. So a lot of my years in prison was spent lost, confused, hurt, unable to process the emotions. And when unable to process the emotions, it continued to fuel the anger, continue to fuel the violence inside of these prison environments. So I believe that every man and woman who is serving time, we need to educate them. Rehabilitation should start the day they're sentenced. And the day that they're sentenced, they need to learn what are the different levels of incarceration, what are the different ways and how you process emotion, because every man or woman who's incarcerated, they're going to hit a wall of emotions. And either if they don't know how to process them, that can lead to more violence and disruptive behavior in prison. But if we teach people how to process the hurt that they have caused themselves as a result of their crime, I believe that we will prepare people to be better people as they move forward in their journey in life while they're serving time, and then they return back into the communities healthier and ready to be more productive because they have finally had an opportunity to heal. As I said earlier, Mahatma Gandhi said, no human being is so bad as to be beyond redemption. I was convicted of murder, but that should not prevent me or anyone who's been serving time in prison from the road of redemption. Thank you guys. Be blessed.